Hello and welcome to The Shift. I'm Brett Chamberlain, your host today, and the Director of Community Engagement at the Story of Stuff project. Well, we started this series back in April to talk with the thinkers and doers shaping how we're responding to the coronavirus pandemic and what comes after. But over the past month, our focus has widened to consider a broader set of overlapping crises, from the ongoing public health emergency to the centuries-old crisis of racial inequality and injustice in this country, and the accelerating climate crisis, which threatens the health of ecosystems and human communities in every corner of the globe. These issues are inextricably bound, and they demand our attention and our action. But in these moments of disaster and despair, these are often when we see humanity at its best, communities coming together to put need before greed, and to work cooperatively toward a just and sustainable future, and in so doing to disprove time and again that old conservative myth that greed is a natural feature of the human condition. So this week we're talking about cooperatives, collectives, and mutual aid. From trade unions to your local grocery co-op, we'll explore what we gain when we work together. And I'm pleased to be joined by two guests today, Shavaun Evans and Andrew Delmonte. Shavaun is co-director for the New Economy Coalition, a network of organizations imagining and building a future where people, communities, and ecosystems thrive. Shavaun is in her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, where she's a founding board member of the Black-led childcare collective Play Cousins Collective, a member of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and a yoga instructor. And I'm also joined by Andrew Delmonte, Director of Cooperative Development for People United for Sustainable Housing Buffalo, and a lifelong resident of Buffalo's West Side. Andrew previously organized and advocated for independent businesses as president and program director of Buffalo First, helping to shift public opinion, public policy, purchasing dollars, and community investment into Buffalo's local economy. Thank you both for joining me. So as we start every episode, I'd love to ask you both, in this moment of challenge, how have the last few months been for you, for your communities, and for your work? Shavaun, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. Really grateful to be on this program today and to share this space with you and Andrew. So thank you. And yeah, thanks for asking how things are going. So as you mentioned in the intro, I'm actually based in Louisville, Kentucky, which is my hometown. And I'm sure as folks across the nation know and across the world know, we've lost two incredible folks here in the past few weeks and months, Breonna Taylor and David McAtee, both at the hands of police, being murdered by police. And there's been just some incredible organizing that has been happening here for years that is continuing to build on this moment and really to try to make sure that we have justice for the folks that we have lost by police brutality. So it's been just a really incredible show of support from folks across the world for our community, an incredible show of solidarity and cooperation within the Louisville community itself to make sure that we're taking care of one another. And we've really just been building on the generations and the decades of work around solidarity work and collective coming together and just really taking care of one another that's been happening here for so long. So we're definitely in a moment of an incredible revolution that we're seeing, some incredible movement and some incredible organizing that's happening, and just really trying to stay strong and make sure that we can continue that into the future and make sure that we can win.
That's great, Shavaun. Well, thank you again for joining us. Andrew, turning to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm thrilled to be here with you and Shavaun also. Buffalo, like many of our cities, has been dealing head on with the current moment. We've lost some very important lives here over the years too, due to police brutality. And folks have been showing up in the streets and taking care of each other, both with the protests and the important actions that are happening, and also due to the coronavirus pandemic. And I think being a part of a very tight-knit community on Buffalo's West Side and being a part of Push Buffalo's very tight-knit membership community, we're lucky that we have a lot of this infrastructure in place to be able to support one another and to shift very quickly. And I'm heartened by the countless hours folks are putting in to do mutual aid work, to make sure folks have food, can pay their rent, and to meet their needs in this time. So it's been inspiring, and it's also been tough. And we've had our moment in the national spotlight with a Push Buffalo member, Marty Gugino, being pushed by the police and still recovering in the hospital now. And his desire to be out there on the streets in this moment, and the words that he shared since, reminding us that Black Lives Matter and that that's the focus of this moment, has been really heartening too.
Well, thank you for joining us as well, Andrew. Now, I'd like to help get our feet under us in this conversation by just defining some terms. So the title of this episode is Cooperatives, Collectives, and Mutual Aid, terms that might seem opaque to some. So Shavaun, perhaps you could help us understand, to start, what are cooperatives and collectives?
Sure, happy to give an overview of those. And just to help to set us here as well, just want to make sure that folks, as we're talking about this today, really ground us in that so many of these things that we'll be talking about have been, again, happening for generations in our communities. So many of our communities are built on cooperative economics and working collectively together. But when we think about kind of the definition of cooperative today, it's an organization or a business that's owned and democratically governed by its members. And so a lot of folks have probably heard of the phrase like one worker, one vote, one member, one vote. And so each member of a cooperative would have one vote on major decisions within the organization or business. Another big piece to really think about when we're talking about cooperatives is that cooperatives are most often built out of a need of a community. So it's something that folks are coming together to work together around and work cooperatively around to fill a need or to meet that need that's within the community. And then when we're thinking about collectives, generally we would view a collective as something that is managed without hierarchy. So in many ways similar to a cooperative, something that's managed without a hierarchy and where everyone has equal decision-making power.
That's great, thank you. And then to add one more term into the mix there, Andrew, could you help us talk a little bit about mutual aid?
Sure. In talking about mutual aid, I always like to frame the conversation in the sense of like, often mutual aid springs up in moments of crisis, right? And we've been referring to this particular flashpoint in the generations-old crisis that Black and Brown folks face in this country. And we've also been talking about the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And yet, I think it's important to refocus that in the sense of like, capitalism is the crisis, right? And mutual aid has existed as long as huge gaps in folks' needs have existed due to what this system determines is valuable or important or not valuable and not important, right? And so the simplest way I think of it is mutual aid is filling the gaps between what the capitalist economy is neglecting. And it's folks, individual folks or communities coming together to share what they have with folks who may need it. It can be a quick and random moment. It can be a very orchestrated and careful thing. And some classic examples would be education programs that the Black Panthers engaged in during the Civil Rights Movement. Certainly a lot of the disaster mutual aid work that's going on right now due to the coronavirus. Push Buffalo's membership has been helping to raise money and get groceries to folks in this time when they can't afford their rent or can't afford food and things like that. And even just like small moments of mutual aid where like when workers are protesting unsafe working conditions, folks showing up and giving them food so that they can continue to be out there on the street and get their message heard.
That's great. Well, thanks for helping us get our feet under us with those definitions. So perhaps we can bring a little color to those with some examples. Shavaun, I mentioned in your introduction that you're a member of a childcare collective. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that to help us understand how collectives and cooperatives can actually function on a day-to-day basis. What do they feel like to their members and to communities that benefit from them?
Sure, that's a great question. So when I think about the childcare collective that I work with, Play Cousins Collective, it really makes me think about some of the informal things that my mom and grandmother and aunties used to do when they had small children. And so my mom would watch part of the community's children one day of the week when her children were small. And then another day of the week, one of my aunties or one of her cousins would watch the kids. And so those kind of informal childcare swaps where folks are making sure that the village is raising the children and making sure that we are supporting each other in our times of need is really what the basis of groups like Play Cousins and a number of other childcare collectives across the country and the world are based on. And with Play Cousins, we do a variety of things. Our core piece is actually providing community childcare to folks. So we're able to go into spaces in the community like protests, like community meetings, like school events, things where parents are often expected to be at and want to participate in so that they can really help to shape their communities. We're often in those spaces and provide the childcare and children's programming so that folks are able to really be a part of their community. And we base all of these things off of, as I was mentioning before, these cooperatives and collectives are often coming out of needs that folks in a community feel. And one of the biggest needs that the Black folks that we were working with in this collective have stated is that, we really need more culturally appropriate programming and lesson plans and education for our Black children. So all of our lesson plans that we bring into those childcare settings are focused on Black characters, they're focused on POC books, so that we're really able to share with these children the beauty of them being Black and the beauty of them being a Black person in this world. So it's been a really incredible experience for myself being a part of the collective for several years and just seeing the momentum that we've really been able to gain with so many folks who are being directly impacted by lack of access to childcare or lack of culturally appropriate programming in our schools and community settings, really being able to see those folks have leadership and ownership over this collective has been just an incredible experience.
That sounds really wonderful. I'm sorry?
No, thanks. I was just going to say I lift up Play Cousins Collective, but then also recognize the incredible other collectives and cooperatives that, as I mentioned, Play Cousins and so many others have really taken inspiration from. And so one of the ones that I think that a lot of folks, when we think about cooperative work and cooperatives, in particular in the South, one of the major ones I really want to lift up is the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. So something that's given so much inspiration to folks, and that being a number of Black farmers and Black farm co-ops that have come together for generations to really ensure that they're able to support one another and provide good food to their communities and have a way of living for the Black farmers in the South as well.
So cooperatives and collectives are really just a couple of the institutional structures or modes of organizing communities that exist under the rubric of what we often refer to as the solidarity economy. Wondering if perhaps both of you could talk a little bit more about some of the other structures and ways that the solidarity economy is expressed, and of course the values that drive it. We touched a little bit about on this in terms of ensuring that communities are represented and reflected, and that the structures and ensuring that the needs that are often overlooked by capitalism are addressed. Could you add some other examples of cooperative structures or expressions of the solidarity economy? Andrew, perhaps from your work there in Buffalo?
Sure. Yeah, so cooperatives, and we'll get into this a little bit more. Number one, come in all stripes, right? So you've got cooperatives where folks get together around a need where we might classify it in this current system as a consumer need. So it's a consumer-owned co-op. There's producer-owned co-ops where a number of producers, whether they're individual artists or agricultural farmers, get together to meet their needs and share marketing and resources. And then there's the worker-owned model, which is what we focus on a lot at Push Buffalo through our work in Cooperation Buffalo. But then beyond that, there are many other models of collective governance and ownership, like community land trusts, which we're very happy to have supported, starting the first one in Buffalo in a very long time, called the Fruit Belt Community Land Trust, which is taking back some ownership and some control over a historically Black neighborhood that is right up against a massive health and human services area that has been gentrifying rapidly, and many new hospital buildings and sort of like healthcare industry things have been built around them. And as housing prices and rents rise, We've been supporting the amazing work of India Walton, who's the executive director of that land trust, to own some of the land. There's lots of city-owned lots, and we put some pressure on the city to be able to say, hey, the community needs to own this and be able to write its own future, rather than gentrification and the systems at play writing a future that we know how it's going to play out, because it's played out so many other places. So that's a key example I like to bring up too.
Yeah, that's great. When you mentioned writing that new future, Shavaun, the organization that you're the co-director of, New Economy Coalition, really does work to call that, that new economy, that new future that works for everyone into being. What does that future look like to you, and what's the path to get there?
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier before, but I just like to make sure that folks know too that, we call ourselves the New Economy Coalition. But again, so much of this work has really been built on the decades and the generations of cooperation and community work that folks have been doing. So for so many of our communities, they've been doing this for years, but it's really what we see as being that next or new system that we're working towards. And really that system, it's taking everything that we have today when you think about the current economy of it being a dominant economy, of an extractive economy, and shifting and moving that so that we have a regenerative economy, so that we have something that's built on cooperation and mutual aid and respect for each other and for the earth. So it's really looking to be able to shift what we currently have as an economy that is trying to, in some ways, demand control of the people, and really moving towards an economy where the people have control and community control together. And in practice, that looks like a lot of what we've already mentioned before. It's those things with mutual aid and showing up for one another and caring for one another. It's things like having affordable housing and community-controlled housing through opportunities like community land trusts. It's having worker-owned businesses and cooperatives. It's having things where you're able to actually decide where your city budget is going, things like participatory budgeting, as opposed to the city telling you where your tax dollars and where the budget dollars are going to go. So it's really looking at that opportunity for folks to be able to have community control over the economy as being that next system that we're moving towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Shavaun, you've noted that although this is a vision for the future that we're discussing, it's in so many ways just built on existing structures, things that are generations old, modes of organizing communities. I'm reminded of this book that I started reading in prep for this interview. It's called For All the People, The Hidden History of Cooperatives, Cooperative Movements, and Communalism in America by John Curl. And I think that that's really key in that subtitle. It is a hidden history. So much of the conversation, particularly around business and communities in this country, focuses on the singular visionary leader, an industrialist like Henry Ford or Steve Jobs. And we overlook the myriad ways in that communities have come together to ensure that everyone's needs are met. I'm wondering if you both could perhaps think of an example from past generations of folks organizing cooperatively or collectively that may have been overlooked from our history and yet bears remembering and celebrating. Andrew, it looks like you may have something in mind.
I do. I'm going to shout out another book suggestion for those watching. Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon-Nemhard, which chronicles a history that is so often erased, particularly in this talk of cooperatives and collectives, the history of African-American owned and operated co-ops. And in Buffalo, we have a very rich history in the Black community of just that, of cooperatives and mutual aid. And yet, as a white person, when I go walking around the street and talking about co-ops, everybody thinks I'm talking about the largely white-led grocery co-op in our sort of gentrified neighborhood, right? And yet, when I'm talking about this, I'm really talking about the many Black-owned grocery stores that have emerged in Buffalo's east side. Buffalo's an incredibly segregated city, and that have popped up again during these moments of particular economic crisis. But we have a history that goes all the way back to at least 1929. There was an organization called the Buffalo Cooperative Economic Society, which was founded by a Black physician and existed for 30 plus years. Their biggest project was a grocery store that was in operation for a very long time as a cooperative, but they also did a whole bunch of cooperative education and sort of mutual aid and collective education for youth and for the community. And there were a lot of other programs that started from this organization that was started back then. So that's story in the Buffalo history that I always like to lift up.
Shavaun?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. I'd also just lift up, we were mentioning before community land trusts. And so one community land trust that I think folks often maybe haven't heard about or sometimes gets overlooked is actually the one that's considered the first community land trust in the US, which is New Communities in Georgia. So that was an incredible community land trust that was started. And as we were talking about earlier, those are often able to really help to support land access, housing access, a sense of community for folks. And this was something that was started by Black folks in South in Georgia many years ago, and is something that is still going today. So always love to lift up the incredible work of the organizers of the New Communities Land Trust.
For anyone that's not familiar, could you just explain what a community land trust is?
Sure. So a community land trust is something that can really help, again, with the affordability of both housing and land. And most of the forms that we see, it's something where folks will actually own potentially the structures that are on top of the land. When you think about a house being on top of the land, so folks would own that particular structure individually, but then the land itself is held in trust in an organization, so that if there is a need for a person to sell the part of the property that they own, the housing structure, it's something that can stay affordable for the folks that are buying into it, so that it can stay affordable for the next generation of folks that are looking to be in that community land trust.
That's great. I'd like to take a moment to do a little bit of myth busting here. I find that often in conversations with free market types, with economic conservatives, with capitalists, the conversation often gets back to this kind of disagreement around first principles. It often ends when they say, well, listen, at the end of the day, people are fundamentally greedy. They're looking out for themselves. We need the profit motive to encourage market activity. And if you try and implement collective structures, you'll always find that someone is going to take advantage for their own enrichment. And so it does get to this question about human nature. And as noted in the introduction, we often see in moments of disaster and struggle, people's real cooperative nature emerges. I wonder if either of you have thoughts about that you'd like to share. Andrew, I see some more nodding.
It's a juicy question. The thought that initially comes to mind is a relatively simple one. It's assuming that that retort assumes that this free market system is free and that folks are engaging in it freely, right? And I think for the vast majority of folks, the options are so limited, so much wealth is accumulated by the 1% and smaller percentages above that those of us who don't have much need to look out for ourselves and our individual interests. And that's sort of like built into the system by design, right? And if that pressure valve were released, I don't think the assumption should be that everyone would only be looking out for themselves, right? And I think when we see these moments of economic crisis where suddenly the realities of Black and brown and other marginalized folks hit more white folks all of a sudden, like what we're seeing in this coronavirus pandemic, suddenly everybody gets the communal aspects of mutual aid and cooperatives and how important this stuff is, right? And I'm heartened by how many folks, and in my sense, I would consider have been radicalized by this moment of what's been going on, and with so many folks unemployed and turning to things like, working together to make sure that everybody can get their rent or get their food that they need just for their families. And these are instinctual things that we as humans do incredibly naturally and do in these moments of crisis. And folks in Black and brown and other marginalized communities have been doing in this extended crisis that they've been in for generations, right? And so I think this is just as instinctual as anything else, and perhaps more so.
Mm-hmm. Shavaun, let me turn to you with another myth, although you're certainly welcome to respond to that point as well. One objection that I've heard before as well is that, well, if these alternative structures compared to private ownership are really so great, why aren't they the default model? Well, as it turns out, there are many institutional and ideological hurdles that still prevent the more widespread adoption of them. Could you speak a little bit about some of the barriers that our system puts in place to adopting cooperative models, and how we might accelerate the transition and make these options more accessible to more consumers and workers alike?
Sure. So I think one of the things that our members have definitely identified as being a barrier for more just acceptance and ownership of worker cooperatives across the country has really been around policy. And as you're mentioning, a lot of institutional barriers, in addition to a number of policy barriers that are currently in place. Our members actually worked together for several years to help to build out a policy toolkit to really help to define some of the policy needs that we're seeing around worker cooperatives and community-controlled housing, financial institutions, and climate justice. It's called Pathways to a People's Economy, but just some of the big things that have come from that are just like, simple things that you would think about as being a major need for worker co-ops, things like financial support for worker cooperatives. There's a need for more data and research about worker cooperatives that comes from all levels of government so that there can be more support. There's a need for more educational and technical assistance programs for worker co-ops. Again, something that can be community driven, but oftentimes that legislative or local support from a local city government can be very key in helping to spread that across the community. There's also just need for different structures for incentives that really encourage worker cooperative businesses and encourage their growth. So I think that those are a number of the pieces that we are seeing as being some of the major barriers for worker co-ops in particular to be able to scale and grow and really to have the support that they need to be able to become more of the mainstream within this country. But the last thing I'll say too is that we are seeing quite a bit of growth of worker cooperatives across the U.S. So it's something where we've seen some incredible gains over the past few years, and in particular, when thinking about the worker cooperative census that a number of groups helped to lead up, we're seeing some major percentage jumps in worker cooperatives, both the number of businesses that are formally co-ops, but then also the businesses that might be more informal or might not have that particular legal structure for the cooperative. So I think it's something that's definitely growing and making its way more and more into what we would consider the mainstream of this country.
So if someone is listening and is interested in starting a cooperative or a collective in their community, be it whether they're an existing business owner or just someone that is looking for an alternative solution for childcare, what are some steps that they might take or resources that could help them start on that path? Shavaun, could we start with you?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a lot of resources. I'll try to run down them pretty quickly. So folks can definitely take a look at neweconomy.net, which is the New Economy Coalition's website. We have a listing of all of our members, and you can see a map of where they're located as well. So folks can go there, see if there's different organizations that are working on these particular issue areas that they're interested in, and then be able to connect with them there as well. And then the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, I'd really love to lift up. They're doing incredible work nationally and have so many different members that have cooperatives across the U.S. that, again, would be a great entry point for folks to get engaged in this work.
And Andrew, any suggestions you'd like to add?
One other that I'll add to what Shavaun was saying is a national network of small place-based loan funds called the Seed Commons Wealth Cooperative. Cooperation Buffalo, our worker co-op development program here on the ground is a member of Seed Commons. And it's a really powerful model where in different regions throughout the country, and we've had more and more of these loan funds pop up, which is really powerful. Folks on the ground can get paired up with technical assistants like myself and like many other folks working in this field to build out a business model, build out a plan so that, and if there is capital needed, then we can go to the Seed Commons loan fund, which is cooperatively managed by all of us across the country who participate in it, to lend out funding to those co-ops if they need it to start up or if they're buying out a business that was owned by someone else. Who's retiring or just looking to pass it off to their workers. And those loans operate in a very non-extractive way. So things like credit score and a collateral mix are very different than the traditional lenders. And really the security for those loans is the authentic relationships that we as the folks supporting have on the ground as that business continues to grow and create surplus and then share that surplus back with the financial cooperative at the national level. And then importantly with the workers who are building wealth for themselves at the co-op.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you both for those tips. We're coming to the end of our program here, so I'd just love to get any last thoughts from both of you, particularly calls to action to the community. How might folks get involved to help promote these values in the world? Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think the only thing I really want to impart on folks is that we've come back to this a lot, but these ideas are old, these ideas are not new, and these ideas have lots of folks within our communities who are very well versed in them already. So meet those folks, talk to those folks, start building things from this place where we're at and meeting each other's needs due to the crises we're in right now, and through the mutual aid structures that have developed, and think about ways where those mutual aid structures can become perhaps more permanent structures for us, how we're going to permanently organize our communities to engage in solidarity and not charity with one another, and to really just practice these things, right? Because the more we practice these things, the more we will be ready for the moment when we really need to make this shift.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And Shavaun, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, just lifting up everything that Andrew said as well. Also want to lift up that the work that I've been doing in Louisville with Play Cousins. I know the work of a number of groups across the country also doing solidarity economy work oftentimes actually came both from the need that folks were seeing in the community and also in study groups. So just really want to lift up the opportunity for folks that if you're interested in doing something like this with solidarity economy model organizing in your community, oftentimes it can be really useful to be able to get a group of folks together, do study groups and readings around the books that we've mentioned today, like Collective Courage, and to really understand the history of this movement and how we can really work in our communities to build on that. So just want to lift up that opportunity for folks. And I know there's some great study groups that have been happening across the country. One in Chicago in particular, Colonet Collaboratives, Cooperation for Liberation, and some incredible organizing that's been happening in Pennsylvania with a group called PACA. So there's lots of different groups that have been able to build some incredible work off of coming together in solidarity to be able to do studying and learning with one another.
That's wonderful. Well, Shavaun Evans, Andrew Delmonte, thank you both so much. It really has been a pleasure speaking with you. I'm sure that our audience will have learned so much. Really appreciate both of you taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us all. So thank you for joining us here on The Shift, and the rest of you tune in next week for another conversation.